It started with a single envelope sitting on my kitchen counter in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of envelope you don't open lightly, because something about it already feels wrong. I remember staring at it for a long time, thinking it was just routine medical paperwork, nothing life-changing. I had no idea that inside that thin paper was a truth that would break 35 years of marriage apart in seconds. When I finally opened it, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The words inside didn't make sense at first, like my brain refused to accept them. Non-biological match. That was the phrase that stopped my heart. My youngest son, Jason, the boy I raised, the boy I taught how to ride a bike, how to shave, how to drive, was not mine. And the worst part wasn't even the test. It was realizing my wife Linda had known something all along. Something she never told me. Something she buried for decades while I lived in ignorance right under my own roof. And when I looked up from that paper, she was standing in the doorway watching me like she already knew what I had found. If this story resonates with you, please take a second to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And I genuinely mean this. Let me know what city or country you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 67 years old, and I'm telling you right now, that night in my kitchen was the moment everything I believed about my family started to collapse, and I never saw it coming. I remember saying her name out loud, slowly, like I was trying to hold myself together. Linda, what is this? She didn't answer right away. She just looked at the paper in my hand, then at me, like she was measuring how much truth I could survive. I asked her again, louder this time, tell me this is wrong. And she finally stepped inside the kitchen, closing the door behind her, like that would somehow keep the rest of the world from hearing what was about to happen. She said, Michael, it's not that simple. That sentence alone made my stomach drop, because nothing about 35 years of marriage should ever be not that simple. I told her, it's simple. He's not mine. Is that what you're saying? She looked away, and that silence told me everything before her words did. My mind went straight to Jason, my youngest, the boy who had just called me earlier that afternoon asking if I wanted anything from the store, completely normal, completely innocent, completely unaware that his entire identity was about to be questioned. I remember asking her, does he know? And she said, no. And you shouldn't tell him like this. That's when something inside me cracked. Not anger yet, just confusion so deep it felt like I was drowning in my own house. Then she added, almost whispering, Michael, you need to understand why I did what I did. I stepped back from her without even realizing it, and said, you did what? My voice didn't even sound like mine anymore. She finally sat down at the kitchen table like her legs couldn't hold her weight, and that's when I noticed her hands were trembling too. She said my name again, softer this time. It was a long time ago, before things were what they are now. And I stopped her right there, because I didn't want vague answers, I wanted the truth. Before what, Linda? Before our marriage? Before our family? Before I raised a child that isn't mine? She didn't respond, and in that silence I felt something even worse than betrayal forming, something bigger, something unfinished. Because right then I realized this wasn't just about a mistake from the past. It was about a secret that someone had worked very hard to keep buried for 35 years, and I had a terrifying feeling I was only seeing the edge of it, not the truth itself. And what I was about to learn next would make that DNA test look like the least painful part of the story. After she sat there in silence, not answering my questions, I found myself staring at her face like it was the first time I had ever really looked at my wife in 35 years. And instead of getting answers, I started getting memories. Pieces of the past I had never questioned before, but suddenly felt heavy in a way they never had. I remember Jason as a little boy, maybe 6 years old, standing in our old kitchen in Columbus, holding a drawing he made at school, smiling like nothing in the world could touch him. And Linda always reacted differently with him compared to our oldest son, David. I never noticed it clearly back then, or maybe I chose not to. David was always my boy, in every sense. Rough edges, stubborn like me, always asking me for help with things like fixing his bike or throwing a baseball in the yard, while Jason was quieter, more attached to Linda, always sitting closer to her at dinner, always asking her questions instead of me. I remember one evening clearly. I said, Jason, come throw the ball with your brother. And he looked at Linda first before answering, like he was waiting for permission. She smiled and said softly, he is tired, Michael. let him stay with me for a bit. I did not think much of it then, but now that moment replayed in my head like something I had missed on purpose. Another memory came up, Jason's 8th birthday, small family gathering in our backyard, hot summer air in Ohio. And I remember David got a new bicycle from me, something I had saved for months to buy, while Jason got a watch from Linda, something she insisted on picking herself, something I never even saw before she wrapped it. I joked that day, "Looks like you two planned this perfectly," and Linda laughed a little too quickly and said, "We just know what each child needs." Jason hugged her more than me that day, and I told myself that was normal, that kids go through phases. But sitting in that kitchen now, with that test results still on the counter, those small moments did not feel small anymore. They felt arranged, almost like someone had been careful about every detail. I finally broke the silence and said, "You always were closer to him than I was." Linda looked up quickly and said, "That is not true." But her voice was too sharp, too immediate, like she had been waiting for that accusation. I leaned against the counter and said, "Then explain it to me, because I just realized I do not know my own life." She looked down at her hands again and said, "You think this is easy for me?" And I replied, "No, Linda, I think this has been easy for you for a very long time, and I was the only one who did not know it." That made her flinch slightly, and for a moment I saw something different in her expression, not anger, not denial, but fear. I asked her quietly, "When did this start?" And she said nothing. The house felt too quiet, like even the refrigerator humming in the corner was too loud. I walked past her and looked at a framed photo on the wall, Jason at graduation, smiling in a way that looked exactly like he belonged there, like nothing in his life had ever been uncertain. I said under my breath, "There is something you are not telling me." And Linda finally stood up, her chair scraping slightly against the floor, and she said, "Michael, you need to stop asking questions you are not ready to hear the answer to." That sentence hit harder than anything else she had said, because it sounded less like a warning and more like a confirmation that the truth was not just hidden, it was still actively protected, and whatever had happened all those years ago was still not finished, not even close. I stood there watching Linda as she said I was not ready for the truth, and for the first time in my life I did something I had never done before in our marriage. I did not raise my voice, I did not demand an answer immediately, I just stayed silent. And that silence felt heavier than any argument we had ever had, like something inside me had shifted and I was no longer reacting the way I used to. I turned away from her and walked into the living room, sitting down slowly on the old leather chair I had owned for more than 20 years, and I just stared at the wall, trying to process what I already knew without wanting to fully accept it. A few days passed like that, quiet, tense, like the house itself was holding its breath. And during that time, I kept replaying every memory of Jason, every birthday, every school event, every time he called me Dad, and I answered without hesitation. Then something unexpected happened that broke the silence in a different way. I received a call from my old coworker at the engineering firm I had retired from in Columbus, Ohio, asking if I would be willing to come in as a guest speaker for a community mentorship program for young engineers. I almost said no out of habit, but something in me paused, and I heard myself say, "Yes, I will do it." Even Linda looked surprised when I told her I agreed. She said, "You have not spoken in front of a group in years." I replied quietly, "Maybe it is time I start again." The event was held in a conference center downtown, and I remember standing behind the curtain before walking out, feeling a kind of nervous energy I had not felt in a long time. When I stepped onto the stage, I did not expect much, just a polite audience, maybe a few questions, but something different happened. My talk about engineering systems and problem solving apparently resonated more than I expected, and afterwards several people came up to me, asking questions, thanking me, even inviting me to consult on small projects. One of them was a representative from a local technical advisory board, and they asked if I would consider joining as a senior consultant. I remember laughing softly and saying, "I am retired," but they insisted, saying experience like mine was rare. I agreed to think about it, not realizing that this single moment was the first crack in my quiet retirement life reopening into something larger. When I came home that night, Jason was there unexpectedly, sitting at the kitchen table with Linda. He looked up and said, "Dad, Mom said you had a meeting today." I nodded and said, "Something like that." Linda was watching me closely, like she was trying to read whether I was different now. Jason smiled and said, "That is great. You always were good at that kind of work." For some reason, hearing him call me dad that night felt different, not because it was wrong, but because I suddenly started questioning what it meant in a way I never had before. Later that evening, after Jason went upstairs, Linda said quietly, "You seem calmer." I answered, "I am not calm. I am just not reacting the same way anymore." That made her stop mid-step. There was a long pause before she said, "Michael, please do not let this turn into something it does not need to be." I looked at her and said, "It already is." "Something, Linda. I just do not know how big it is yet." She did not respond and walked away into the hallway. That night, I could not sleep, and for the first time I started writing things down, dates, memories, small inconsistencies I had ignored for decades. And somewhere in that process I realized something was building, not just in my mind, but around my family, like pressure in the air before a storm, and I had a feeling that very soon, someone else was going to walk into this story with answers I was not prepared to hear. I did not realize at first how quickly things were starting to shift around me, like the ground beneath my life was no longer stable, but slowly being pulled in different directions without me fully seeing it. It began with Linda changing her tone in small but deliberate ways, especially when Jason was around. One evening at dinner she casually said, "Michael has been under a lot of stress lately. He sometimes misreads things." Jason looked at me and asked, "What does she mean by that?" And I replied, "Nothing important," even though I could feel the weight behind her words. It was the first time I noticed her shaping a version of reality that did not match what I knew, and doing it so smoothly that it almost felt normal. A few days later, Jason mentioned something that made my stomach tighten. He said, "Mom told me you were confused about some medical paperwork, and that is why you are upset." I put my fork down slowly and asked, "She said that?" Jason nodded and added, "She said you might be mixing things up because of your memory." I turned toward Linda, who was calmly drinking water like nothing had happened, and I asked, "Why would you say that to him?" She responded softly, "I did not say it like that. I just told him you have been overwhelmed lately." Her voice was steady, controlled, almost rehearsed, and Jason immediately said, "Dad, she is just worried about you." That sentence hit me harder than I expected, not because of anger, but because I could see how easily the story was being rewritten around me. Later that night, I overheard a conversation I was not meant to hear. Jason was in the hallway speaking quietly with Linda, and I stopped before entering the kitchen. Jason said, "Do you think Dad is okay?" And Linda replied, "He will be fine. He just needs time. Do not bring up the test results again. It is making him anxious." My chest tightened because that was not what I had been told I was reacting to. The way she framed it, it sounded like I was unstable, like I was the problem, not the situation itself. The next morning I tried to call my older son David. When he picked up, I said, "I need to ask you something serious," and he immediately responded, "Mom already told me." I paused and asked, "Told you what?" There was a hesitation before he said, "She said you have been having trouble accepting some medical information and that you might be jumping to conclusions." I closed my eyes for a second and said, "David, listen to me carefully. I am not confused." But he interrupted me and said, "Dad, I think you should talk to someone professionally before you upset Jason more." That was the first time I felt completely displaced in my own family, like every person I trusted was now speaking from the same script that I had never seen. When I confronted Linda that afternoon, I did not raise my voice. I simply said, "You are telling them I am not thinking clearly." She looked at me and said, "I am trying to protect you from making this worse than it already is." I said, "Worse than what?" And she did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked past me, took Jason's jacket from the chair, and said, "You are not well right now, Michael, and I think you need to accept that." Jason was standing nearby and looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I looked at him and asked, "Do you believe that?" He hesitated, then said, "I just think Mom knows you better right now." That moment felt like something inside me collapsing quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow internal break where I realized I was no longer the one defining reality inside my own home. Linda then placed a folder on the table and said, "We should review some options for support." And as I looked at it, I realized every page inside was prepared in advance, structured, organized, like this conclusion had already been decided. Long before I was ever asked for my opinion, I stood there staring at the papers, listening to the silence in the room. And for the first time, I understood something deeply unsettling. I was no longer part of the conversation. I was the subject of it. And as I looked up at both of them standing on the other side of the table, I felt the entire foundation of my life finally begin to give way in ways I could no longer hold together. I did not realize how fast silence could become a weapon in my own home. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that slowly replaces your voice until no one is listening anymore. After that meeting in the kitchen, things did not explode the way I expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, everything became quieter, more controlled, and that made it worse. The first attempt to reach out came from me when I called Jason that evening. He picked up after a few rings and I said, "Jason, we need to talk without your mother in the room." There was a pause before he answered, "Dad, Mom said you should rest and not stress yourself with these conversations." I closed my eyes and said, "I am not stressed. I am trying to understand what is happening to my own family." He replied softly, "She is just worried about you." Then he hung up after saying he would call me later, but he never did that night. The next morning I tried again, this time texting him. I wrote, "Jason, please just talk to me directly. Do not let anyone interpret things for you." The message showed as read, but no response came. I also tried David, my older son, and left a voicemail saying, "I need you to hear me without assumptions. Call me when you can." Hours passed, then a short text arrived from him saying, "Mom already explained everything. I think you need space right now." I stared at that message for a long time because it did not sound like David. It sounded like something placed into his mind rather than something he chose to say. That night, I checked my email and found a message from Linda sent to both of our sons, the subject line reading, "Dad needs rest and support right now." And inside it she wrote that I was processing emotional confusion and misinterpreting medical information due to stress. There was even a suggestion that I should temporarily avoid making major decisions. I remember sitting in the dark living room reading that email over and over, realizing she was not just speaking to me anymore. She was building a version of me for everyone else to believe in. I tried replying to the email, but my message never got acknowledged. The next day, I received a call from a number I did not recognize. It was a family friend named Robert who said, "Michael, I heard you are going through something difficult. If you need help, I can recommend a counselor." I asked him, "Who told you that?" And there was a pause before he said, "Linda mentioned it briefly. She is just concerned." I felt something tighten in my chest because now it was outside the family too, spreading quietly through conversations I was not part of. I confronted Linda again that evening and said, "You are telling people I cannot think clearly." She responded calmly, "I am protecting you from misunderstanding yourself." I said, "You are isolating me from my own children." And she replied, "I am trying to keep this from getting worse." Jason walked into the room during this and said, "Dad, I think you are making Mom upset for no reason." I looked at him and said, "Jason, I am your father. I am talking to you directly." But he avoided my eyes and said, "I just want things to be normal again." That word, normal, felt like it no longer included me. Later that week, I tried sending handwritten letters to both of my sons, simple letters, just asking them to meet me for coffee. No pressure, no confrontation, just conversation. Neither of them responded. The letters were never mentioned again. I even tried going to David's house, but he came to the door briefly and said, "Dad, Mom asked me not to get involved right now. I think you should respect that." I stood there for a moment, not angry, just empty, and said, "So I am the only one not allowed to speak now?" He did not answer. He just looked uncomfortable and closed the door slowly. On the drive home, I realized I had stopped trying to defend myself in every conversation, not because I agreed with what was being said, but because every attempt to explain myself was turning into another layer of distance. When I got back home, the house felt different, quieter in a way that was no longer temporary but settled, like I had already been removed from the center of it. I sat alone at the kitchen table where everything had started, no calls coming in, no messages being answered, and for the first time I understood that I was no longer being argued with. I was being avoided completely, and in that silence I found myself fully alone inside a life that still looked familiar but no longer felt like it belonged to me. I stopped trying to reach them after a while, not because I accepted what was happening, but because I realized every attempt to connect was only pushing me further outside of my own family, like I was knocking on a door that was already being closed from the inside. The house in Columbus felt quieter every day, not in a peaceful way, but in a way that made every sound feel distant, like I was living slightly outside of time. I remember one afternoon sitting alone in the kitchen when the phone rang, and for a second I thought it might be Jason. Instead it was David, and his voice sounded careful, almost rehearsed. He said, "Dad, I think you should stop trying to contact us for a while." I asked him, "Do you hear yourself right now?" And there was a pause before he answered. "Mom said you are not handling things well, and I think she is right." I remember gripping the edge of the table and saying quietly, "David, I raised you." He replied, "I know, but things are different now." And then he ended the call. That was the moment I realized I was no longer just being avoided. I was being replaced in conversations about my own life. A few days later, I received a message from Jason that simply said, "I think we need space, Dad." No explanation, no emotion, just distance in 6 words. I did not respond immediately. I just sat there looking at it until the screen went dark. Later that week, I went to the small cemetery on the edge of town where my parents were buried, not because I had planned to, but because I found myself driving there without thinking. I remember standing in front of the headstone and saying under my breath, "I do not know what I am supposed to do anymore." And for the first time in a long time, there was no one there to respond, no explanation waiting on the other side of silence. That night, Linda told me she was going to stay at a friend's house for a few days. She said it gently, almost carefully, like she was avoiding adding more weight to something already heavy. Jason packed a small bag and said, "I will check in later." I asked him, "Later when?" And he just shrugged slightly and said, "I do not know." Watching him leave felt like watching a version of my life walking out the door without looking back. After they were gone, the house felt too large, like it had expanded to fill the absence. I walked through each room slowly, noticing things I had ignored before, like how many photos on the walls still showed a family that no longer functioned the same way. I found myself sitting in Jason's empty room, looking at the shelf where his old school trophies were still lined up, and I remember saying out loud, "How did I become a stranger here?" And the silence that followed felt like an answer I did not want to accept. That night, I barely slept, not because of anger, but because of recognition, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting reality and start seeing it clearly for what it is. In the early morning light, I wrote one sentence on a piece of paper and left it on the kitchen counter, not addressed to anyone. Just a simple statement that I needed to understand what was real and what had been rewritten without me. And as I stood there looking at it, I realized something was changing inside me, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like the beginning of acceptance forming where confusion used to be. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was waiting for them to come back. The same way, I did not realize at first that rebuilding a life after everything collapses feels less like starting over and more like learning how to exist without the people who used to define every part of your day. But that is exactly where I found myself in the weeks that followed, sitting alone in the same Columbus house, but living in a completely different reality. I stopped waiting for phone calls that would not come and started structuring my days with a kind of discipline I had not used in years. Every morning I woke up at 6, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table not to think about what was lost, but to decide what could still be built. One morning, I received a message from the engineering advisory board I had once spoken to, asking if I would be willing to take on a short-term consulting project for a regional infrastructure review. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Yes, I will take it." When I arrived at the office building downtown Columbus, I remember walking through the glass doors and hearing someone say, "Michael Carter, we were hoping you would say yes." It was a simple sentence, but it felt like the first time in a long time someone was addressing me as more than a problem to be managed. The work itself was familiar, reviewing structural reports, analyzing system efficiency, discussing solutions in long conference rooms filled with people who actually listened when I spoke. During one of those meetings, a younger engineer named Thomas leaned over and said, "You explain this in a way that actually makes sense. Most people do not." I replied quietly, "I have had a long time to think about how things break down." He smiled and said, "Then we are lucky to have you here." That was the first time I noticed something changing, not in my circumstances yet, but in how I was being seen again. After the meeting, the board director approached me and said, "We would like to extend your involvement into a permanent advisory position if you are open to it." I hesitated only briefly before answering. I am open to rebuilding. It was not a dramatic moment, but it felt like the first real step forward I had taken without looking back over my shoulder. At home, the silence remained, but it no longer felt like rejection. It felt like space, empty but usable. I began organizing old documents, updating professional contacts I had not spoken to in years, and even revisiting technical notes I had written long ago but never shared. One evening, I received a call from an old colleague, Robert, who said, "I heard you are back in the field. People are talking about your work again." I responded, "I never left the field, I just stepped away for a while." He laughed softly and said, "Well, it sounds like you are back in a way that matters." I did not respond right away, because I realized I was no longer trying to return to who I was before. I was building something new entirely, something that did not depend on approval or recognition from the past. Later that night, I sat by the window of my house looking out at the quiet street, and I thought about how strange it was that the same life that once felt like it had ended was now slowly taking on shape again, not through people returning, but through me choosing to move forward without them. I opened my notebook and wrote down a simple plan for the next month: meetings, consultations, small goals, nothing grand, just steady steps. And as I closed it, I realized for the first time I was not waiting for anyone to restore my place in the world. I was actively building a new one, and somewhere in that realization I understood that what came next would no longer be about loss, but about what I was becoming instead. I did not notice the exact moment I stopped feeling like someone trying to recover a life and started feeling like someone building a new identity entirely, but it became clear one morning when I stood in front of the mirror, adjusted a freshly issued identification badge, and realized I no longer looked like a retired man trying to stay relevant, but like someone who had stepped back into purpose with intention. The badge read Senior Engineering Consultant, Regional Infrastructure Advisory Board, Columbus Division, and seeing my name printed beneath that title felt strangely unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone I was still learning how to become. When I arrived at the downtown engineering office that morning, the receptionist looked up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Carter, the team is waiting for you in Conference Room 3. That simple acknowledgement carried more weight than I expected, not because of status, but because it was the first time in a long time I was being addressed with certainty instead of hesitation. Inside the conference room, a large table was surrounded by engineers and analysts reviewing infrastructure projections for the next fiscal year, and when I entered, the project lead stood up and said, "We are glad to have your input on this. Your experience is exactly what we need." I took my seat, placed my notes down, and said calmly, "Let us start with what is not working before we focus on what is." The room went quiet for a second, then everyone began shifting papers and turning screens toward me. During the discussion, a younger engineer named Thomas pointed at a structural model and said, "We have been struggling with the load distribution on this section," and I leaned forward and replied, "Then you are solving it from the wrong direction. Try recalibrating the support assumptions instead of reinforcing the structure itself." He paused, then said, "That actually makes more sense than anything we have tried so far." Moments like that kept happening, small confirmations that my presence was no longer being questioned but relied upon. After the meeting, the board director approached me and said, "We are formalizing your position. You will be leading regional advisory coordination starting next quarter." I looked at him and asked, "Leading?" And he nodded and said, "Your work has already been influencing decisions. We just want you officially in that role." I did not respond immediately because I was not used to hearing decisions about my life that sounded like expansion instead of limitation. A few days later, I was issued a new access card with my updated title printed clearly, and for the first time I also received a designated office space overlooking the city skyline, a simple room with a desk, a laptop, and a glass wall that looked out over Columbus. One afternoon, while reviewing infrastructure proposals, Thomas walked in and said, "People are starting to talk about how quickly things are improving since you joined." I replied, "Things do not improve quickly. They improve correctly, or they do not improve at all." He smiled and said, "That sounds like something you learned the hard way." I did not answer, but I knew he was right. Outside of work, I began structuring my days differently, waking up earlier, reading technical briefs, and attending planning sessions that required decisions affecting entire regional systems. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like my thoughts had direction again. One evening, I stood alone in my office after everyone had left, looking out at the city lights, and I said quietly to myself, "So this is what it feels like to be needed again, not in an emotional sense, but in a practical one, where your presence actually affects outcomes." As I turned off the lights and picked up my coat, I noticed the reflection of my badge in the glass wall, steady, official, undeniable. And in that reflection, I did not see the man who had been left behind in silence. I saw someone who had started moving forward without permission from the past. And as I stepped out of the building and into the cold Columbus night air, I understood that the present was no longer waiting for resolution. It was already in motion. I had learned how to function again, how to speak in meetings without hesitation, how to sign documents with a steady hand, how to walk through hallways in downtown Columbus without feeling like I was being erased from my own life. But nothing prepared me for the moment the past started calling me back into it. It came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in my office at the advisory board building, reviewing structural risk assessments, when my assistant knocked gently and said, "Mr. Carter, there is someone here asking to speak with you privately. It is about a personal matter." I looked up and asked, "Who is it?" And she hesitated before replying. She said her name is Linda. I did not move for a second. Just hearing that name pulled something tight inside me. Not anger, not shock, something heavier, like unfinished time. I stood up slowly and said, "Send her in." When she entered the office, she looked different than I remembered, not in appearance, but in presence, like she was no longer walking into a shared life, but stepping into a place she no longer controlled. She closed the door behind her and said softly, "Michael, I did not want to come here, but this could not wait." I gestured toward the chair across from me and said, "Then sit and tell me why you are here." She sat down carefully, placing her hands on her lap, and said, "Jason is with me." That name hit the room before anything else could. I asked, "Why is he not at work or home?" And she replied, "Because he needed to hear something from both of us at the same time." I leaned back slightly and said, "Linda, I have heard enough things separately that never matched. If you brought him here, then say what you need to say." There was a pause before she continued. "He has been asking questions again, about the past, about his medical records, about everything." I felt my chest tighten but kept my voice steady and said, "And you told him what this time?" She looked down briefly and said, "I told him I could not keep carrying it alone anymore." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. My assistant opened it slightly and said, "He is here." Jason stepped into the office slowly, not like he used to, not casual or comfortable, but cautious, like he was entering a space that no longer belonged to any version of certainty. He looked at me first, then at Linda, and said, "Mom said we both need to be here for this." I nodded and replied, "Then we are all here. Now just say what needs to be said." Jason sat down next to her, and for a moment none of us spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city beyond the glass walls. Jason finally said, "I went to get copies of my records from the clinic," and he placed a folder on the table. I noticed Linda's hand tighten slightly when he did that. Jason continued, "There is something that does not match what I was told growing up." I looked at him and said, "What kind of mismatch?" And he hesitated before answering. "It is about my birth information, about what I was told versus what is actually documented." The room felt smaller instantly. Linda said quickly, "Jason, we do not need to go through this here." But Jason shook his head and said, "We do. I cannot keep living with half answers." I looked at the folder but did not open it yet. Instead, I said quietly, "Before we do anything, I need you to understand something. Whatever is in there changes nothing about how I see you as a person." Jason looked at me for the first time with something close to uncertainty and said, "I wish I believed that would be enough." Linda reached forward slightly as if to stop him, then stopped herself and said, "Michael, just read it." I placed my hand on the folder but did not open it immediately. The silence stretched between all three of us, thick enough to feel like it had weight. Jason said softly, "I just want to know what is real." And in that moment, with my hand still resting on the edge of the truth that had been hidden for decades, I realized that whatever was written inside that folder would not just explain the past, it would decide what was left of everything I thought I understood right now. I did not move my hand away from the folder when Jason finally said, "Open it." Because at that point the weight of everything in the room was no longer about fear of what I might find, but certainty that whatever was inside had already been shaping our lives long before this moment. Linda was sitting perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the table, not on me, not on Jason, as if she had already left the conversation and was only waiting for the impact. Jason leaned forward slightly and said again, softer this time, "I just need to know the truth, whatever it is." I looked at him and said calmly, "Then you deserve to hear it directly, not through assumptions." I opened the folder. The first page was not emotional, not dramatic, just clinical records, dates, signatures, and a line that confirmed what had already been suspected but never fully spoken. Jason did not move. He just stared at the page and said, "So this is real." His voice was not loud. It was controlled, almost careful, like he was trying not to let it break. I turned the document slightly toward Linda and said, "You knew this?" She finally looked up at me and replied, "I knew parts of it." Jason asked immediately, "What does that mean?" And the room tightened again, not from volume, but from precision. Linda took a breath and said, "It means I did not tell the full story when I should have." Jason leaned back slowly in his chair and said, "All my life, I thought I knew where I came from." I responded quietly, "You still know who raised you." Jason looked at me directly for the first time since entering the room and said, "That is not what I am asking anymore." There was a long silence before he continued. "I met someone at the clinic, a coordinator who checked the records with me, and they told me there were inconsistencies that should have never been ignored." Linda interrupted immediately, "Jason, that is not how it happened." But Jason raised his hand slightly and said, "Let me finish." The tone was not aggressive, but it carried a kind of authority that had not been there before. He placed another document on the table and said, "This is the corrected record they issued after I requested verification." I looked at it without touching it yet and said, "Corrected by who?" Jason answered, "By the institution that originally processed everything." Linda's expression changed slightly, not into panic, but into something more contained, like realization. Jason continued, "They confirmed there were errors in how information was recorded and communicated over time." I finally looked at Linda and said, "Errors that were never corrected in 30 years. She replied softly, "I was told things that were not complete at the time." Jason shook his head and said, "Stop saying it like it was something that just happened to you." The room went quiet again, but this time it was different, because something had shifted in control. Jason was no longer waiting for answers. He was organizing them. He looked at me and said, "You said you just found out recently, but I am starting to think you were never actually told anything at all." I did not respond immediately, because I realized he was not asking anymore. He was testing consistency, not emotion. Linda said quietly, "Jason, please. Understand this was complicated." Jason replied, "Everything has been complicated for me, apparently without my knowledge." I leaned forward slightly and said, "What are you asking us right now?" Jason looked at both of us and said, "I am asking who decided what I was allowed to know and when." No one answered. And in that silence, I noticed something I had not seen before. Jason was not confused anymore. He was no longer the center of uncertainty. He was the one defining the terms of the conversation. Linda looked at me briefly and then back at him and said, "We thought we were protecting you." Jason responded, "We're controlling what I could see." The words were not loud, but they landed with precision. I sat back in my chair and realized this was no longer about hidden past events. It was about present accountability. Jason stood up slowly, not in anger, but in decision, and said, "I am done receiving fragments of my own life." He looked at me one last time and added, "From this point forward, I will be dealing with facts, not explanations." And as he picked up the folder and turned toward the door, I understood something with absolute clarity that neither of them were ready to fully face yet. The version of this family they had controlled for decades no longer existed in this room, and what had replaced it was something none of us could reverse. I remained seated long after Jason left the office, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Linda was still there, but something about her posture had changed, less certainty, more hesitation, like she was no longer sure what role she was supposed to play in a conversation she had once controlled. I looked at her and said calmly, This is no longer something you can manage with partial explanations. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she folded her hands and said, I never tried to control anything. I was trying to hold the family together. I nodded slightly and replied, Then you understand why that is no longer possible in the same way. That sentence seemed to land on her more than anything else I had said so far. Jason's departure had already changed the structure of the room, not physically, but in authority, because now there was no shared assumption that things would return to how they were. Linda finally said, He is going to distance himself from both of us. I answered, No, he is going to distance himself from confusion. There is a difference. She looked at me for a long moment and said, You are speaking like someone who has already decided everything. I replied quietly, No, I am speaking like someone who has stopped asking permission to understand reality. That was when she stood up and said, You think you are the only one who has been carrying weight in this situation? I did not raise my voice. I simply said, I think we have been carrying different versions of the same weight, but only one of us was allowed to define it. The silence that followed was not empty anymore. It was structured, like something had been permanently placed between us that could not be moved back. A few days later, I received a message from Jason, but it was not a question or a request, it was a statement. It said, I verified everything through independent records. I am not discussing interpretations anymore. I read it twice before replying, Understood. That was the first time I responded to him without trying to explain, correct, or bridge the gap. Not long after, David called again, but his tone was different, less aligned, more uncertain. He said, Dad, I do not know what to believe anymore. I answered, Then do not believe anything yet. Just look at what is documented. He said quietly, That is not what Mom says. I replied, Then you are listening to two different frameworks of the same history. He did not respond after that. In the following weeks, I noticed something subtle but undeniable. Conversations stopped circling around interpretation and started circling around documentation, facts, records, confirmations. Even Linda began speaking differently when she was present, less certainty in her tone, more careful phrasing, as if every sentence now required validation. One evening, she said to me, Jason is staying with David for a while. I replied, That is his decision. She nodded slowly and said, He is not ready to speak to me directly yet. I looked at her and said, That is also his decision. For the first time, she did not try to adjust the narrative. She simply said, I did not think it would end up like this. I answered, It has not ended. It has just stopped being controlled. Later that night, I stood in my office looking at the city lights through the glass, and I realized the distance between all of us was no longer emotional confusion. It was structural separation, each of us operating with our own confirmed version of events. Jason's last message still sat on my phone, unread responses from both sides now replaced by silence that was no longer temporary. I understood then that reconciliation was no longer the question being asked. The question had shifted into something far more permanent, and none of us had agreed yet on what to do with the space that truth had left behind. I no longer measure my days by what I lost, but by what no longer controls me. And somewhere in that quiet realization my life in Columbus, Ohio, began to feel different, not perfect, not untouched by memory, but finally my own again. The house is still the same house, the same kitchen, the same streets outside the window, but the silence no longer feels like rejection. It feels like space I can breathe in without asking permission. Jason and David keep their distance, and I have stopped reaching into places where my voice is not welcomed. There are no more calls that I wait for in the evening, no more explanations I try to assemble from fragments of conversations that do not belong to me anymore. Instead, there is work, steady and structured, the advisory board, the engineering reviews, the responsibility that asks for clarity rather than emotional negotiation. And for the first time in years, I feel useful without needing to be understood first. Linda and I speak rarely now, and when we do, it is no longer about the past, but about logistics, boundaries, and what remains necessary. There is no anger left in those exchanges, only distance that has been acknowledged rather than argued over. I understand now that truth does not always arrive as relief, sometimes. It arrives as separation, and you have to decide whether you will collapse under it or rebuild something honest from what remains. I chose to rebuild, not the family I thought I had, but the version of myself that existed outside of it. I learned that silence can either erase you or return you to yourself, depending on how you stand inside it. And for anyone listening who feels unseen, or questioned, or replaced in their own story, I want you to know something simple. You are not required to shrink yourself to remain part of a narrative that no longer respects your truth. Sometimes the most powerful decision is not to convince others, but to stop abandoning yourself in order to be believed. If this story reached you in any way, thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for sharing this space with me. And if you feel comfortable, you can leave a comment, share where you are listening from, and subscribe, not for the story itself, but for the reminder that you are not alone in what you are carrying. My name is Michael Carter. I am 67 years old, and the core lesson I carry from everything that happened is that you cannot heal in a place that still requires you to deny your reality. And if there is one quiet truth I hope you take with you, it is this: your life does not begin when everyone agrees with you. It begins the moment you stop waiting for permission to live it. If you found meaning in this story, there are more stories like this waiting for you, each one carrying its own truth, its own silence, its own beginning, and perhaps the next one will speak to something you have not yet put into words, but already feel inside you, and I hope you will join me there.